Please welcome New York Times best-selling author, Dan Heath.
So you and a friend are having a picnic beside a river, and you've just laid out your picnic blanket, you're preparing to have a feast, when you hear a shout from behind you in the direction of the river, and you both look back. There's a child in the river thrashing around, apparently drowning. So you both instinctively dive in immediately. You fish out the child, you bring them to shore, and just as you're starting to kind of calm down from the adrenaline rush of all that, you hear a second shout. You look back, there's another child in the river, also apparently drowning. So right back in you go. You rescue that child, you bring them to shore. No sooner have you done that, now it's two kids in the river. And so begins this kind of revolving door of rescue. You're in and you're out and you're saving lives, and it's starting to get a bit exhausting. And right about that time, you notice your friend swimming to shore, stepping out, and starting to walk away as though to leave you alone. You say, "Hey, where are you going? I can't do this. I can't rescue all these kids by myself." And your friend says, "I'm going upstream to tackle the guy who's throwing all these kids in the river." And when I first heard that parable, it just stuck with me because I think it captures so nicely this trap that we all recognize, right? This trap of reaction. Every day we come to work, we fight the same fires, we respond to the same emergencies. It's react, react, react. And we so rarely make the space and devote the time we need to get upstream and solve the problems at their root. And that, in a nutshell, is the message of my talk today, that we should be moving more of our time, more of our resources, more of our energy upstream. And the stories and principles I'm going to share with you are drawn from the 5th book that I've written. It's a book called, appropriately enough, Upstream. So the structure of the talk is pretty simple. We're going to talk about 3 things. What's the promise of upstream work? Why bother? The second is, why do we so often find ourselves downstream, just fishing out those kids again and again and again? And then finally, how can we resist those forces and push upstream? So let's start at the top there. You all know Expedia, the online travel site. What you may not know is this crazy story. I honestly could barely even believe this was true when I first heard it. I met a guy named Ryan O'Neill who was in charge of the customer experience team at Expedia. He said a few years back he was going through some data, came across something that made his jaw drop. He checked it 3 times to make sure it was right. I want to share with you the actual data that he had discovered. So what he had found was that for every 100 customers who booked a reservation with Expedia, a flight, a hotel room, a rental car, check this out. 58 of them ended up calling customer service for help. 58 out of 100, which would seem to nullify, the whole point of having an online self-service travel site, right? So everybody is running around with their hair on fire saying, why are so many customers calling us? And why didn't we know? So they do some digging in the data. Doesn't take them long to unearth the number one reason people are calling, drum roll please, to get a copy of their itinerary. To get a copy of their itinerary. Folks, 20 million calls were placed to Expedia in 1 year by people seeking a copy of their itinerary. It's like every man, woman, and child in Florida calling Expedia in 1 year. So what did they do? Well, you can predict what they did. We're good at emergencies, right? This was an emergency. And so they created a war room. They started going daily reports to the CEO. Are we whittling away at that number? Turns out the technical solutions to this problem actually weren't all that complicated. So what was happening, I should say first in Expedia's defense, just to be clear, it's not like they just forgot to send the itineraries, right? Oh, I knew we were forgetting something. It was the itineraries. No, they were always sending them. It's just that sometimes they were getting blocked by spam filters. Sometimes customers were deleting them, thinking that they were advertisements. So they shook things up, right? They figured out ways to evade the spam filters. They changed the subject lines and the content to make sure nobody could mistake them for advertisements. And very quickly, folks, especially through the help of some self-service tools they created as well, 20 million calls goes down to what is today basically 0. Like, nobody ever calls Expedia anymore for an itinerary. This is a $100 million victory at about $5 on average per call to service this. So as a technical challenge, this is pretty trivial, right? I mean, you all solve harder problems like this every day. But what's interesting to me is actually something a little different. How does a problem like this scale to this insane level, 20 million calls before action is taken? Like, we would have predicted probably that by the time you get your 4 millionth call for an itinerary, there's like an alarm bell going on some executive's desk and they would swoop into action. It didn't happen. Why? Well, I think the answer actually reveals something really important and really disadvantageous about the way we structure our businesses. So at Expedia, like virtually every other large organization, they organize themselves into silos. There's a marketing team, and the marketing team has their own objectives, so they might be responsible for getting visitors to the site. And then they work with a product team that designs a beautiful web interface and tries to funnel those visitors down to make a reservation. So maybe they get judged, for instance, on the percentage of visitors that end up booking some kind of reservation. And then further down the chain, you've got the tech team. And they make sure that all the plumbing, all the systems are running along brilliantly. They might be measured on things like the percentage of server uptime. How many nines can they stack up? And then finally, at the end of the chain, we have our friends in support. And part of their job is to just get people off the phone, right? To minimize call time. But of course, it's not just that, or every time somebody called, they would immediately slam down the receiver, right? So they also have to make sure that the issue is resolved to the satisfaction of the customer. So if you look at this, at first glance, this all makes good sense, right? We have a big company, big challenge. We break it up into components. We give every group something that they can control. We measure them on that thing. Check, 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 check. But if you ask a very simple question like this, whose job is it to ensure that customers don't need to call? The answer is nobody. Nobody's job. In fact, it's even worse than that. Nobody even stood to benefit in this whole system when that call volume declined by 20 million calls. Think about it. Expedia won a $100 million victory, and nobody was a hero. Nobody got a better performance review. It wasn't on any of the metrics that they were being judged by. And in fact, it was even a threat to some people. Think about this. What happens? Call volume goes down by 20 million. What happens to the call center manager? They get a visit from somebody in finance, don't they? Well, Heath, I was just noticing that the call volume is plunging. I think we might want to take a look at headcount and make sure to rationalize that, right? This is actually bad news for a lot of people in the system. So this is a problem that emerged in the spaces between the silos that we created intentionally for the sake of efficiency. And this brings me to maybe my favorite quote from all of the research I did for this book. It comes from a healthcare expert named Paul Batalden. And Batalden said that, and I hope this quote sticks in your head the way it has for me, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Isn't that great? Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So in other words, we could think about Expedia. We could look at them and we could say, by golly, somebody built a machine to produce 20 million itinerary-seeking calls a year. Like, isn't that something? And then you could sort of look at the system through that lens and ask, what choices did they make that allowed them to produce that many calls? And then you start to get to these absurdities where every person in every one of those silos could be great, could get good check marks, and meanwhile, at the systems level, it was a disaster, right? Optimized for the part instead of for the whole. And this is what I hope you'll take away. We can unlock huge value when we see the system as a whole.